personally. Cool.
That's true.
Wait, why is the speaker? Oh man, we're almost there. Good old Zoom. We needed the audio to come out of there, right?
Would you prefer Teams? That'd be more familiar.
It's just the teams.
Is that good? Can people hear us on the speakerphone?
It says to turn up your volume.
That's be. I don't know.
I see in the chat.
Yeah,
Thumbs up in the chat.
Yeah, it just says.
Okay. Oh, phew. All right, cool. We good?
Click that up. So it's yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
shit.
No.
No. Where's the arrangement? Oh my god.
This is it. Never seen that
The
thing.
thing is, I don't know the arrangement of the displays.
Yeah.
Okay,
I start.
Oh, man.
Now.
okay.
Right.
All right. Cool. So, how do I begin? One of the things I love about being in this community with all of you is how obviously caring and welcome we all are. As the half an hour banter, I think is good. I think that it's a common stereotype in our industry that, you know, we're out of touch. But I'm really proud of how I think the Ruby community is almost stereotyped as but like super inclusive. I think that's really cool. I think a lot of people who come to Ruby are really proud of that. And I think that's the reason why we have a lot of people here who don't write Ruby anymore, but still hang out at Ruby meetup. But I have bad news, which is that as an industry, our products are incredibly unwelcoming to people with disabilities. You can do your own Googling, but depending on who you ask, between 70 and 99% of the internet is considered unusable for people who are blind. But I have some good news, which is that we can do better. And we've been working on making GitHub a lot more usable for people who have disabilities. And basically what I'm going to do today is share what's worked for us, with the goal that I'm going to help you figure out what to do with your company so that you can go back and do something cool for people with disabilities and whatever products you're working on. So I guess I'll do a quick intro. I'm a staff engineer at GitHub. I've been working on UI related stuff for like 6 years now. These days we care a lot about accessibility, so that's what I do at this point. It's the 6th year in a row. Thank you for having me, guys. Yeah, thank you for the shirts. It's fun. Yeah. So I guess I'll start with a quick recap from what I talked about last year, because I'm going to build on last year's talk. If you were at Rocky Mountain Ruby, I also gave the same talk there. So I talked about how we used Axe, which is an automated accessibility scanning tool. It puts red lines around stuff in your app if they're not accessible. I talked about how this is nice, it's automated, but it can't catch everything. I talked about how we use some custom form builders, some custom Rails form builders to basically take certain accessibility errors and make them harder to commit. And I talked about how we use Lookbook, which you can think of as basically Storybook, that has built-in accessibility tools. And you can use it to isolate pieces of your UI, some people call them components or partials, and test it for accessibility using that Axe tooling. And I gave this talk a bunch of times, and it was well received, but I found the Q&A afterwards was way better, especially at Rocky Mountain Ruby. People had a lot of really good questions, and I realized that that was a sign that I should have given a different talk. So today is that talk, which is what I should have given last year based on all of y'all's feedback and the feedback of people at other conferences. And the questions basically all amounted to, that's nice, but how do you scale it? Which is something that I think, you know, we're in a Rails meetup, we're super used to hearing that, especially for people outside the community. You know, you're having a lot of fun, but can you scale what you're doing? So more specifically, the questions were like, you know, how do you get people with the money to care about it? How do you make an entire application accessible, not just like a piece of it? You know, I gave a lot of examples about how to make like one thing accessible. How do you make the whole thing accessible? And then how do you keep it that way? You know, it's a lot of work. You don't want it to regress. So before I get too far, how many of you here know, how many of you have accessibility goals at your company that you know of? Raise your hand high so we can. Okay,
Maybe I made them, okay.
okay, so like a quarter. How many of you have actually worked on them personally?
Previously?
Yeah, you worked on it.
Previous company.
Yeah, people that work for me do it?
Joel,
What did you- okay,
it's
so-
accessible.
What, oh. What did you do? I'm curious.
I just did what you told me. I took Axe and I went through all the issues.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I got it down to 0 issues. It was great. Although my designer was pissed.
Did you make him change all the colors?
He had to change the colors, he had to change the font weight, he had to change the font size. He was so mad.
Did you take his glasses away so that he'd appreciate it?
I didn't tell him he said that.
Funny story, one of the hardest projects I've worked on at GitHub is changing the color of the green button. It's like so entrenched in our identity, it's like the one color in our UI, it's like green button, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, the color contrast was like 2.5 to 1, we needed it to be like 4 to 1,
Right.
4.5 to 1. Yeah. I actually didn't talk that, see, already, good talk for next year.
Green button.
Changing the green button.
Yeah.
Actually turns a funny story, like, you know, when we showed dark mode, everyone's like, oh, sweet, get us dark mode.
Yeah.
It was actually for accessibility. Because we need to be able to support people who are colorblind, they're red, green colorblind, and it turns out we use like red and green for like to symbolize like whether something is like passing or failing. So the
Right.
people thought it was for dark mode, that was the
I
public
do
version.
appreciate the dark mode though.
Yeah.
Very.
Anyways, so we worked on making GitHub accessible for a long time. It took a lot of different forms over the years, and there were a couple different teams who cared about it, and it kind of went in fits and starts for the longest time, but it was never really like a company-wide goal. We never really had any specific goals for accessibility. It was just like, oh, some people cared about it and they would go in and make changes or massive apps that didn't really work very well. But that all changed on a fateful day in 2018. We got bought by Microsoft. Because it turns out Microsoft cares very deeply about accessibility. It's one of the things I'm most proud about having been acquired by them. It's often a negotiable, I should say non-negotiable requirement whenever we're selling to big governments, big companies, because they face exposure if they aren't providing accessible experiences to their employees and the people who use their software.
What kind of exposure do they face? Like, what's that?
Uh,
Isn't there a reason that GitHub had to start this, besides just Microsoft? Okay.
I'll get there, you're ruining. That's my next slide after this one. Next one. Yeah, you're asking all the questions you asked last time. See, this is why I did the talk. So, you know, I think that the thing I want to get out of the way is that there are, of course, tons of like non-technical and non-economic reasons to make your product accessible. I think we could probably all agree it's the right thing to do, which means I'm not going to talk about that because there are a lot of things that are the right thing to do that your company will never do. Probably most of them. But so today I'm going to focus on like the pragmatic and often really honestly capitalistic reasons why you should do this work. And number one reason, Rylan, is that it's a legal risk. I'm not a lawyer, but I wouldn't be working on this if we hadn't faced legal pressure. And we are not alone. And the thing is that this is actually something that is just true about accessibility in general, even before digital accessibility. So lawsuits have long been an effective tool in what has actually resulted in the world being accessible. Like people think that it's laws, but it's actually, like, for example, from the New York Times, this guy filed 180 disability lawsuits, and it was the way he made his world accessible. Like he sued the restaurant that like he literally could not dine at because like he couldn't get his wheelchair at the door. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, he had to be accommodated, and they made the change. So, for decades, this is how it's worked in what I would call the real world accessibility space, which is that, people have sued for their right to use public spaces. And the same is now becoming true for digital accessibility. There's an article in Forbes that talks about how they say exponentially. I think the writer does not know what exponentially is. But the data I saw, because it's actually that they doubled over 5 years.
Algorithmic.
It's not the same book.
Yeah. I would love to see them use.
Started with like closing the window, not reading.
The point is that they're on the rise. I can say that, of course, I'm doing the work now because we got legal pressure. Specifically NPM got legal pressure, but we're no stranger to it in the Microsoft family of companies. And I now know, working in the industry with other people, that, you know, this is a very common thing. So that's one we can talk about to your company, is, you know, we can sue. But to talk about like what it concretely means for us is that at the end of the day, what you can get sued over is whether someone who is blind can't accomplish the key goals of your product. So like at the end of the day, our goal is to basically say, if you're blind, you can make like our user experience works for you. Means you can use assistive technology. We generally target screen readers. I'm not going to go into that a ton, but it's basically a piece of software that looks at the web page and reads to you what's there, because if you can't see, that's how you consume it. So in practice, what this has meant for us is we are trying to accommodate and comply with the WCAG 2.1, which is published by the W3C. And you can think of this as like basically the international standard for accessibility. You can imagine that if a company is like, we want your software to be accessible, they'll be like, what is your WCAG compliance? So it's a way for us to say we're WCAG compliant, and then like the companies that come in and buy our software can be like, okay, cool, we talk the same language. It's used by companies and governments, and it's really what drives purchasing decisions. So whenever I talk about, yes.
It drives purchasing decisions, or it disqualifies?
Well, you could look at it both ways. Like if we're accessible and GitLab isn't, we're going to get the deal.
Got it.
And you know, for a lot of these companies, it's a pretty strong point. I know that there are deals that we're waiting to pass certain thresholds that we haven't passed yet. Like with big multinationals that are like tons of money that like they motivate you to get across the finish line. Sure. Yeah.
Is there multiple, like, is there competitors to WCAG, or is that the one?
Is that the one? I'd say generally, there's actually like not a ton of like deviation or like competition for standards in the space. It's pretty, we actually don't technically use WCAG, we use like the Microsoft version of it, but like it's easier to just talk about it because it's the fact that it supersedes it straight up. So, yeah. I think that like for the sake of like, if you're gonna go back to your company, like the WCAG guidelines are like pretty well recognized that if you want to like research how to like address a certain one, if you're to Google it, you're going to get good results. That's the reason why I think it's like the good thing to anchor. It might not be exactly what you decide makes sense, and I'll talk about some more practical ways.
That's what PayPal uses too.
Yeah, I would say that like section 508, which is like one of the regulations, is WCAG. Anyways, a lot of jargon. I think that it's always good to provide a caveat. GitHub is big, you have 4,000 employees, so a lot of things I'm about to say. I would love questions about like, how can I do that at my company? Because like I've tried to guess, but like I'm blinded by working with, you know, like literally we have like 1,500 engineers, right? It's massive. Like we're a massive Rails monolith. Everyone asks me all the time. We are still a monolith. Most of our application and API traffic still goes through that monolith. We have about 2,000 pages in the monolith, which I've been told is a lot. Like 2,000 unique, like actual pages you can visit. Seems like a lot to me. 95% of those are still ERB, about 5% are React. So I'm curious, for the sake of conversation with all of you, how many engineers are at your company? How many people here have less than 5? Okay, how many have less than 10? Okay, less than 50. Well, more people should be raising their hand. Okay, over 50, say over 50. Yeah, over 50, 1, over 100. 500? 1,000? We're probably in the similar territory.
No, you're bigger.
Okay. Anyway, so like, just know that like, I'm talking about this from the perspective of like 1,600 engineers. Things are different. But I would say that like, from our learnings about the industry, that there's kind of like 3 principles you need to think about in terms of what we've seen make people successful in this work. And the first one is measurement. The second one is what we call durable ownership. And the last one is lived experience. And these are kind of like the 3 tenets that people ask me about in all these Q&As. So a few years ago, I joined the design organization at GitHub, which was fun. It's fun to be an engineer, not in an engineering organization. And I reported to who's eventually our like chief designer, head of design, whatever. And we had a ton of technical debt. And the thing I remember about working with her was that I got really frustrated about it. And I was like complaining about how like we didn't even use our design system properly or something like that. And the thing she said to me was, there will always be something to refactor. Like you could always make our application better. Why should we do this change that you're proposing? You know, how will we even know that we're done, let alone that it was successful? And it really was a turning point for me in my career because like up until then, kind of just did what I wanted and like I kind of like it was kind of cool with whoever I was working for at the time, but like our code base has gotten to the scale that we can't just be constantly changing it because we want to use, you know, double quotes all the time. Like we actually literally can't do that. We tried. It was impossible to land because we have 1,500, those 1,500 people are all committing to one repo. Like, or what do we say? It's like 1,200 commit, yeah, 1,200 people committing to one Rails application. So like, it's very hard to land big things because there's a lot of moving, a lot of commits. So one of my favorite books on measurement is called How to Measure Anything. It is like super dry, I do not read it. I'll summarize it very quickly here, which is that measurements don't actually have to be that precise. They just need to be able to tell you whether you've met your goal or not. So plenty of good measurements can literally be binary. Like, am I alive or not? That's a good success criteria, right? Like you binary, right? Like that's a binary measure of your health. There are more granular measures of your health, but one could say that the binary measure is pretty useful. Then another way, good measurements can be like tests. They let us quickly learn whether we've succeeded or failed. The book talks about how, like, you know, for a lot of people think that you know, premature optimization is the root of all evil. But in measurement, really, it's that trying to make change without a target is the root of all evil. So when it comes to accessibility, we really need to come up with a way to measure the problem we have. Because when you have 2,000 pages, there's no way you're ever going to like just have a feel for it. So luckily at GitHub, our DNS configuration is under source control. So the first thing I did is went to there and it gave us a list of our 100 public domains. This is just one part of our project. And with that list, I went and used a tool called Playwright, which automates a browser. We used it to run Axe and report our stats into Datadog. And this is a crawler we now have that runs every hour. And this runs across all of our public, just root pages for our domains. And this shows that we have 18 Axe violations per page. So about 1,800. We also use that same tooling to scan our design system. So our design system has a bunch of pages that have examples of our components. And you can see that we had the scanning and we actually did a bug bash. This is a timeline over about a month and a half where we went in and fixed our Axe errors. So at your company, if you had done this, you would have seen a nice.
Yeah, mine was a little different scale than yours.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing we did is we took our system tests that we had and we had those for like, honestly, we have it only for like 20 key use cases in our application, which is not good. We had them for like creating pull requests, you know, filing an issue and whatnot. And this graph shows the number of Axe violation types for that same set of tests over, you know, a quarter or so. So while being Axe clean doesn't mean that a page is accessible, your pages might not be accessible, but they're Axe clean. It's a significant improvement over a page with Axe errors. I think the way that I like to describe it is that like, the way one of the lawyers at the company said, it's like if you're Axe clean, you've at least proven that you acknowledge the problem and that you've tried to do something about it. Like a lot of the legal pressure that we've seen has been like, or seen happen in the industry, I should say, is like situations where it's just obvious that no one even tried. So that's the reason why I think Axe is such a great tool, because it does create meaningful improvements, even if it doesn't catch anything, and take some risk off the table. So if you were to go back to your companies and say, hey, I heard this guy talk about how we could get sued because our app doesn't work for blind people. If we do this quarter worth of work to make our application Axe clean, it significantly reduces our legal risk. I think that you'd probably find some amount of appetite to do that work. And that's kind of what we found. Also, those graphs are really important because for non-technical people, that allows them to see the progress you're making. And honestly, like, not a lot of projects go that far at our company to actually show like real, like user-facing progress in the graph, which means that it was really easy for us to ask for more money. And I'll talk later because this work has not been cheap for us. So to kind of summarize, you can't prove what you can't measure. And even a measurement that is a proxy for accessibility, like being Axe clean, can be really useful to demonstrate your progress to the people who control where the money goes. I'd encourage you all to go back and at least measure your acts violations, file a ticket about it, and then set aside some time to resolve them. They're very well documented. In fact, I think they even provide examples for like how to resolve them. Like you could Google the acts violation, you'll probably find good blog posts on how to fix them in your app. So the next thing that was kind of an element of the questions I was asked after last year's talk, is how do you keep it that way? So say you make something Hawksley, how do you keep it that way? And it reminds me of my favorite, one of my favorite metaphors, which is the ship of Theseus. Does anyone know what the ship of Theseus is? You want anyone to explain it for me instead? Have you done it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, man, I think of it not as like, it's like a philosophical concept.
Yeah.
Where like a ship goes like sailing and then gradually over time, every piece of the ship is replaced as it wears out. And then the question is, even after time, when every component of the ship has been replaced, is it still the same ship that originally set sail?
Perfect. That was actually way better than the one I had. Yeah, it's like, is it the same ship? And that ship is github.com. So like github.com has been sailing for 15 years. How many of the people that were sailing on that ship have died and they're terrible? I don't mean it that way. There's different crews sailing the ship.
Yeah.
Right? And the ship has been refactored, right? Fair, gosh, that.
Like it changed, yeah, they're tired.
Wow, this is the rough draft. Talk here and then give it a conference and don't say that. This is not good. But like, I think that this metaphor is really good for the companies we build. And I think that like, well, it's really obvious to me, again, it's probably still more true, even at like really small scale. Like your code gets moved around, like, I don't know about you guys, but like, we reassign teams all the time, and sometimes when they're reassigned, like, their project doesn't get a new team, right? Like, projects are put in maintenance mode, sometimes without warning. People go on parental leave, like I went on paternity leave, and people move on to other jobs, and all these changes are happening around our software. So how do you make sure that like the ship is still built well? So we have a tool for this called the service catalog. And while I will just say this is a big company solution, there are probably some things here that still apply. And this is what it looks like. So basically, we split up our application into things that matter. And we originally created this to track whether we were meeting our SLOs. So you can imagine when we sell our software, especially when it's a cloud offering and it's not available, I think in some cases we literally have to provide refunds to our customers. So we needed software that said, okay, like you couldn't access, like pull requests were broken for 5 minutes this month. Do we owe anyone money? This software helps us do that. What's really great is that as we've broken down our monolith and the services we have around it, what this has done is we now have SLOs. We have an on-call rotation for each one of these kind of groups, like subsets of the company, and we have a chain of command up to a VP. And then what we do is that we tag ownership to that in our code owners. So these map directly up to those services. We're starting to create a mental model here. And we literally have some Ruby. This is actually the only Ruby in my talk, but we can, and we have a little macro control. Oh, shit. I actually had class in my house. Oh shoot, now it's not the right color. No. Okay, well, okay, which one's worse? Is that worse? Okay. So what's nice is that we've forced every single line of our entire stack everywhere to be owned by a service, not by an individual, which means that we don't allow teams of one. I tried. But those services, we start to require that they have like a playbook, they have an on-call rotation, they have documentation. And this rigor has really helped us plug a lot of those gaps as people come and go, as responsibilities change. And I would say that this is actually the most important thing we've done as we've scaled. I know this is an accessibility talk, but this actually applies to basically all of our engineering disciplines. this is what has kept GitHub like alive as a functioning technical system. And I can show you where things get really cool with this. So like, this is Sentry, I like blanked everything out, but we had a timeout and look, got automatically assigned to a service, which means that that service has an on-call rotation and they have an alert threshold. So when there's an exception in anything they own, it automatically routes it to the right person without any need for like a first responder or a triage, like literally gets routed right into PagerDuty based on it. So that is to say, when we care about something at the company, literally anything when it comes to an engineering discipline, we put it into this system. And basically what we do is we create like a set of standards and then we start to add different areas of the company to that set of standards. We call that a scorecard. So a scorecard includes criteria for whether a service is doing a good or bad job at something. So we have like a threshold that says you are either passing or failing, a binary measurement for whether you are good at a certain discipline. An example might be, do you have Dependabot turned on your repo? You are failing if you don't. And that's like just one thing. If you're failing, your VP is automatically notified and they're like held accountable to make sure that you, like, it's basically their job to make sure you pass all of your scorecards. That's actually how we've like taken our leadership and put it into a system about like all the things that we think matter as like an engineering organization. So for example, one of the things we worked on is for accessibility, we have a scorecard that automatically enforces that you're using X. So this is our scorecard and we can see that you basically aren't disabling any of our lints. So you can say that like, okay, 72 of the 81 services that participate in automated accessibility tracking have no more than 10 disables of the linter. So basically what happens, like, you know, you introduce like Rubicop, for example, and I think the best way to introduce Rubicop is introduce it, turn it all on and have it add the disables, because then you get a to-do list. So people will do that with Axe. They'll go in and add all the exceptions. And that allows us to track the overall accessibility. Again, as a proxy for how people are doing. And then we can track participation in that scorecard over time. So this is an example of that in Datadog. You can see that like, you know, what was the number, like 72? Well, we have 220 services. So this is actually how we start to track like making this large scale change at the company. We say, okay, we're going to keep adding these areas of the product into this enforcement. So durable ownership, things change, people die, apparently. Think about ways that you can use systems to make sure that things don't fall through the cracks. The service catalog might be good, probably is too much, but code owners can be pretty good. That works well for most people, and I think it's a fun one. I think even setting up the Sentry integration is pretty fun, like having it automatically page someone if there's an exception. Makes people write better code, in my experience. Yeah. So I think that I said I was going to talk about doing the right thing, but this is kind of like the do the right thing section. At the end of the day, like the goal when you're making something accessible isn't to make apps pass, it isn't the CAG, because you can actually be perfect at those things and your app can still be unusable to people who are blind. So I just want to state, I think the obvious, which is like accessibility work is about making it so people with disabilities can actually use your application. It's not any of the technical stuff. And while you can get pretty far with Axel and catches like half to 3/4 of issues, half to 3/4 of the time, so it's not going to catch everything. So you need to go beyond that to figure out how you can actually empathize with people who are blind. And as a starting point, we got more people to use screen readers. So we have UI developers using screen readers when they do their work. There's one built into OS 10 called VoiceOver. I think most of us here are probably using Macs. There's actually way better ones on Windows. Oddly, the blind community is way more on Windows machines. I'd say like 10-1 probably, because the tooling is way better. That's just how it worked out.
Because they're gamers.
Oh.
That's good.
Okay, what is it? So yeah, using screen readers is a big thing. Has anyone ever worked in a place that had a champions program for anything? I feel like that's like a corporate buzzword that I'm now learning the meaning of. Basically, it's the idea that like, if you have an area of expertise that is really technical and you don't want everyone to learn it, you have a couple people learn it and then they help everyone else like with that work. So one of the things we do is that we got like 50 or 60 people to do like pretty in-depth training on accessibility. So like, while it wasn't their main job, it was their job on their team to represent, like the blind user persona. So they would be trained to use a screen reader, for example, and then when their team is building new features, they would go in and use the screen reader to make sure. And our goal is to basically have that kind of person on every team at the company. So say your company has 3 engineering teams, I could imagine it being useful to train one person on each team to have some level of screen reader expertise. It's something you could do as professional development thing that would be very useful. We of course track that data doc too. And what I think is cool here is that this shows, we classify our issues into, like, when we have an accessibility problem, we classify into different severity levels. And this shows that over time, we are having more and more people that are just these kind of trained employees actually fixing accessibility problems. So like, we ramped up the number of people who are doing it, and they drastically were able to like do this work across the company. For reference, we're looking at probably about 10,000 issues to make GitHub accessible. So you could say that they made, pretty soon they'll have gotten to the point where they've done, a tenth of that work, which is pretty cool. But I think that the obvious thing here is that, like, ideally you should be having people with disabilities use your software. Like, there's really no substitute for that. We have a couple of employees with lived disability experience, but they are a small minority at our company. I think there's probably like 10 of them, and we have 4,000 employees. And I recognize that a smaller company, that's even harder to prioritize and pull off. So what I recommend doing is paying for it. There are a lot of great consultancies out there who specialize in digital accessibility to fill this gap. I'll talk later about like exactly how I'd scope the work, but like, I think a really important thing your company could do is pay someone to use your app who is blind and tell you what it's like. It will probably make you cry. Because literally, it made me cry when I watched someone do it, because it was embarrassing. It was like really embarrassing. We happen to use a consultancy called Prime Access Consulting that is excellent. A little expensive, but very excellent. We also use one called Tetralogical if you're looking for places to potentially spend your company's money. They're both very, very good. So on the product side, we've tried to use this alphabet soup. We've used, and I'll explain these terms, we've used accessibility conformance reports, which are, the template for them is the voluntary product accessibility template, and it's from the Section 508 standard. And basically what that means is we document the current problems in our product for critical workflows. And we happen to publish ours online, so you can go see them and see what they look like. And they're on accessibility.github.com. And here's an example of one. This is WCAG 2.1, info and relationships. We can say that on the GitHub homepage, when you tap skip to main, the screen reader does not announce the content. So like that's an accessibility bug. Just even disclosing this actually helps us get business deals, because the thing that a lot of these companies fear is buying your product and not knowing the risk. They would rather buy, it's a step in the right direction to even say, okay, we know we have these problems. And in fact, it's the first stage that we go through whenever we're working on making part of GitHub accessible, is being like, here are the problems. We literally do an assessment and then we actually publish that assessment. And for some of our customers, that's actually enough, because it allows them to be like, okay, we can handle that level of problem, because they can actually, because it's in that WCAG format, that's a common language, they can go in and say, okay, these violations are not a deal breaker for us. They can even have their user, maybe they have specific users with disabilities that they're trying to accommodate, they can go read that criteria and decide whether to purchase them.
Also gives fodder leverage at negotiation time if you haven't fixed some things you disclosed, coming back to us, it gives you something to fix it. And yeah, it's just more than just visibility for them. But
yeah, I will say we've had clients hold it against us, be like, okay, we talked about this in the sales process.
Hey, we're gonna fix that a year ago, but we didn't fix it.
Exactly. And we have, I wish there was more I could talk about. I thought we should have a meetup where you have to sign an NDA. It's so much better talks under NDAs, but yeah, there's been very real situations where like we've had like stop the assembly line kind of things where it's been like, yeah, that's gonna get fixed before anything else happens because of that situation. So we create these reports, and basically what we do is we pick the key workflows. And you can imagine what they are for GitHub, you can probably imagine what they are for your company or your product. And I don't know if this is a company industry-wide standard, but we do this every year for every critical path. We re-audit it, often at least with a screener, if not with someone who has lived experience. And then we track that audit progress. So, so for example, we have different levels of accessibility issues. We have SLAs around them. So we say like, okay, we find a problem and it's critical. You have to resolve it within 30 days. And occasionally we'll give you an extension. If it's a lower severity, it's 60 days. And of course, you have to keep getting audits on a regular basis. And in fact, what's been interesting now is we've been doing this long enough that we're seeing things re-audit and we're seeing them regress. Like we're actually seeing like these issues come back. But this is kind of, I think this is kind of the expectation you're setting yourself up for if you become a piece of software that is known for being accessible, is that it's not a one-time thing. So you actually need to prove that you remain accessible. If you have a customer that has been with you for many years, they might expect you to be reassessing. It's not something you're going to just do one time. And of course, we track this in Datadog. So this is the number of services that are actually complying with this. I wish I could have labeled this better, but we basically track it over time. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to show larger graphs of this. I checked with work and they're like, you can't show like the year long. So you can show where we're at right now. This is obviously all like kind of super dry stuff, but I think it's like, this is actually, to me, having worked on it, the most compelling thing because it forces you to identify like the key parts of your application that like people couldn't do without. And then just see if they work for someone who's blind. It's pretty simple. It's like, okay, but someone who's blind, open a pull request and get it merged, right? Like if they can't do that, we're screwed, right? And we found that like this is what allows us to like make the case to non-technical people that people with disabilities should be able to give us money. I actually think that that's, if you were to take one thing away from today, you know, make it about the money because it's going to be expensive to do this work. At least I would say that like for a rough ballpark, we're spending like $5 million a year on vendors and audit staffing alone. That's not an internal. And that's likely indefinitely. We also have like 25 people who have accessibility in their title, which is one of the bigger accessibility groups probably in the industry. But you know how much it costs to employ that many people. And I recognize that's a big ask. So we'll talk about some specific user stories that would be good, that would be pretty cheap to do.
So kind of on that point, do you have the insight or opinion on, you try to retrofit this into a massive application? If you had started, if Github had started very early, any project that started early, do you think it's easier to do the re-audit, keep up with things? And would that have a massive impact on perhaps some of the costs that you're paying right now to?
Oh yeah, probably order of magnitude, honestly. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have to build anything new at GitHub. Everything's existing, but like, I would guess it's probably 10 to 1 because like, we don't even have like coverage of components. So like when we fix one page, we don't necessarily, doesn't necessarily make any other pages better, you know? So that's like, if you start with like an accessible component library, like React Aria, if you're using React, or that one's pretty good. That would go a huge way because you're just like taking all those problems off the table, right? Oh yeah, like everything would be easier if I wasn't working on an existing application. Yeah. So yeah, I think that there's kind of 3 user stories that I think that you could get prioritized pretty quickly. I was trying to be as prescriptive as possible so you can't say you didn't try. So as a screen reader user, I can sign up for an account. We failed this one. As a screen reader user, I can upgrade to a paid account. Also failed that one because it was a third party, the iframe, a third party thing, and that was not accessible. And then last one is think about the MVP your company was originally founded on. As a screen reader user, I can get the value of that MVP. I can see the value that this company delivers. So in our case, it's open a PR, did the code review, fast CI, and merge. And I'm going to show you how to do it. You're going to do it with TDD. So this is an example from GitHub projects, the new Git one built in React. And basically what this says is, there's this thing called a sash that you click and drag to resize. Basically we say that when you select it, press enter, press the keyboard right, that the width has changed, and that it's gone back. And basically this just ensures that it can be resized. This is actually not a great example because someone who's using a screen reader doesn't really care. But the point being is that a screen reader user is just only using the keyboard. So what we do in the screen reader test is every time we call an event on the page, we run Axe. So we say, okay, were you able to accomplish that thing with using just a keyboard? And was it Axe clean along the way? Those two things, spoiler alert, get you really, really far. I don't want to say 90% is probably conservative. If you were to write a keyboard only test that passes Axe every step of the way, you might actually accomplish most of the goal without hiring someone with disability. Because that's in practice what it actually boils down to, because they're just using a screen reader, so they're using a keyboard only. And you know, if they can accomplish their goal and it passes Axe, that covers a lot of the accessibility. Another thing you can do is if you don't want to write the test, which I understand maybe you don't, tape over your trackpad once a week for an hour and try and do your work. Try and use your application, and that will help you, at least if you're not using a mouse, start to have some lived experience for keyboard management. Like I said, that actually gets you really far. Like I think that's kind of like the actual nugget from this talk is like just write a keyboard test. Make sure your app works with the keyboard. Make sure it works with the screen reader. Probably get most of the way. Obviously, if you can do the other things, great. But if all of you did that, the world would be such a better place. But I think ultimately, like I said, for lived experience to matter, we still need to employ people with disabilities. And not only that, we need to give them power. So in our case, what I actually think happened is when Microsoft said, hey, you got to do this, someone in the legal department was like, oh, we should hire a blind person and make them run the program. So the head of accessibility for GitHub has a computer science degree. And he is in the legal department, which means that he has a lot more resources. And because he sits outside of engineering, his prioritization is on a whole different level, and that level being above engineering. He's using a screen reader. And I think that like putting him in that position of authority is actually what turned accessibility from a hobby into a competency for the company. And maybe it won't matter at smaller scales, but at our scale, I think you have to have someone that, you know, who has that lived experience. I would probably even go so far as to say that like, of all the things I've seen the leadership at our company do since I've been at the company, that is probably the best thing they've ever done for like the course of the product. So if you can, hire someone blind and give them a lot of power. So it'd be disingenuous not to mention that this work is really, really hard. It can be expensive, it can be time consuming. And I think that like the elephant in the room is it's probably going to slow you down. Beyond being the right thing to do though, your customers will likely start to require it, especially as you go to bigger and bigger customers. Like if I work at Dan's company, a lot of Dan, the corporate guy. There's a lot of big companies for Fusion Auth. And you know, when you start to sign to those customers, like, you know, you're going to have more compliance burden. I think that it's important to mention that this is just one facet of being a company of our size and selling to the customers we do. And I have personally seen how it limits our ability to compete with smaller companies. That it limits our ability to innovate and try new things just on a whim. But if we didn't pursue this work, we run the very real risk of leaving people with disabilities behind. And I think that we can all agree we're at a time of incredible technological progress. Things are moving very quickly with AI and all these new technologies. And I think that my fear is that companies won't prioritize this and people with disabilities will be at a further disadvantage because we'll have left them even further behind in this period of history. So I challenge you guys, go out and measure your product's accessibility. Own up to it, make sure someone's responsible, and then give people with lived experience the power to make it better. Thank you. How long was that?